Okay, off the cuff, lo-fi video. Just got home from work, hard day of book selling and all that. Real thing, you see, not like these other channels. Proper book person. And you will have seen my video, which I put up, was it yesterday? About, going around looking for the new Penguin weird fiction range. And of course, nobody had it, so I went back to work after not being for a couple of days. And of course, we've got them in work, which is great. So I'm going to show them to you now before anybody else does. Ha ha ha. Yes, I know there were pictures of them in yesterday's video, but I thought we'd do it properly. But I'll tell you something really weird. Far weirder than any weird fiction is that Steve Andrews bought a trilogy. Now, yes, this is something which doesn't happen. Somebody else buying a trilogy, nothing special. But being a man who is the king of the singleton, and no, don't give me this standalone business. Standalone is an ugly, conflated bit of newspeak. It's not a real word. I don't care if people use it. I don't care if everybody uses it. What does everybody know about books? Let's have beautiful words. Euphonious, singleton. Isn't that much better than standalone? How utilitarian and dull. But anyway, the point is that I bought a trilogy. Well, I've actually bought this trilogy over a period of several months. And the last one came today. Yes, it's Eric Brown again. And I've got, these are probably out of order, Xenopath, Necropath, pardon me, and Cosmopath, which finally arrived today. Beautiful A format. And I don't do this. I don't buy trilogies. It's not one of my things. I couldn't tell you the last time I bought a trilogy, except when perhaps I upgraded my Lord of the Rings just so it looks nice on the shelf, which is mostly what people do, really, isn't it? Quite frankly. Last time I tried to read Lord of the Rings, well, I managed a little way into the first volume, but I haven't read it all the way through since the 80s. And why would I want to? It's one of those things. But anyway, my love of Eric grows and grows. And what happened is I picked one of them up because it was in print. Then there was somebody on eBay who claimed to have the other two, or access to a wholesaler, because I can read between the lines. And I ordered them both, and one of them turned up, and I said, where's the other? And they said, oh, check the packaging. And I said, man, it's just loose in a jiffy bag. Get with the program. Somebody left it out. So the other one's finally arrived. So there you are. I've got the Path trilogy. Will I ever read it? At some point, yes. But you came here for the weird fiction. So let's have a look at it. And really, the question is, first of all, the question is, what is weird fiction? And then the second question is this a good series? Well, weird fiction, it's something that Lovecraft used to say, isn't it? He used to go about a good weird story will contain these elements. And it isn't really a genre, obviously. So is this Penguin just jumping on the bandwagon? So people use weird fiction. What do they really mean? Well, I'll tell you what I think it is. Weird fiction really is horror fiction. Remember, the horror is a bricolage, not a genre. Some horror is supernatural, some is science fictional in origin, and some is criminal in origin. So it's realist. So it's not a genre, it's a bricolage, an approach, a feel, a marketing category even. So really, how is weird fiction distinct from horror? Well, I'll tell you how it's distinct. It's all about style. It's about style. And I would say the originator of weird fiction is probably Edgar Allan Poe. Now, I'm not saying that Edgar Allan Poe is weird fiction, but Poe influenced a lot of the French symbolists and decadents in the 19th century. People like Baudelaire, the poet, those sort of guys, they were influenced by Poe, and his verbosity spread into their writing. And then it fed back when it was translated into English, into the literary tradition of North America. So when you read people like Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith, Clark Ashton Smith, a writer who would never use a word like bandages when cerements was there to use instead. And that's the difference between the whole thing about standalone and singleton, isn't it, really? It's the beauty of the language. So we do look for that in weird fiction. And we look for it to be lush, and we look for it to be a bit over the top as well, which of course Lovecraft really was. So anyway, on to Penguin and their little weird fiction range, out in time for Halloween, published on the 17th. So this is, whether these are available in the States, I'm not certain. These are British editions. I suspect they might not be. So we begin with nice sort of pink. Can you see pink and purple? Weird fiction, an anthology. doesn't tell you who the editor is, straight away we know we're in trouble. There's no introduction, there's no afterword, there's no historical notes in here. So they've kind of just thrown this together. Now, yeah, it looks very beautiful. It's got the old tentacles on there, as you'd expect. And, you know, the contents are pretty good, you know, but quite honestly, as a commentator on my channel said yesterday, and I quite agree with him, it's like, you know, if you're well versed, this is stuff you know. The Mask of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe. I mean, brilliant story. And yes, that kind of backs up my theory. Then you get The Monkey's Paw by W. Jacobs, which is like one of the most anthologized horror stories of all time. It's good, but, you know, it's not fresh. Then a classic English ghost story, Oh Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad by M.R. James. Now, I wouldn't call that weird fiction. It's a good, original, brilliant English ghost story. I wouldn't say it was weird fiction. A Wicked Voice by Vernon Lee. The Horror of the Heights by Arthur Conan Doyle, which is a science fiction story, which is in, you know, if you buy a science fiction anthology, which is all stuff that's out to copyright, and I've probably got half a dozen sitting around here, you will find that story is in loads of them, and it's a great story. And is it weird? You know, Doyle's style isn't that sort of lush. I mean, compared to a lot of contemporary writing, it's incredibly complex. I mean, I find it easy because he was one of the first people I ever read, but it's not weird fiction as such in my view. Curfall by Edith Wharton, who definitely doesn't fit into that. Edith Wharton, very noted American mainstream social novelist, but she just happened to write lots of ghost stories as well. Where Their Fire Is Not Quenched by May Sinclair. Then, of course, The Call of Cthulhu by H.P. Lovecraft, which is so obvious it's not true. You know, they could have put something less obvious in. So this is kind of thrown together. And also D.K. Broster's Crouching at the Door. So there's a few more obscure things in here. But most of the stories in this have been anthologized to death. So is it a cash-in? Yes. Do I really mind? No, because I think it's nicely designed. And of course, you know, a lot of people will discover this for the first time. So very pretty, I think you'd agree. Now, I don't do this completism thing. I don't do this thing where somebody does a series and I've got to buy the lot. But in this case, I have, because these are attractive books. I'm not certain there'll be any more. And it's also the last time I'm ever going to do it. Now you think, haha, you'll fall for something else. We'll see. Maybe if somebody doozer. Maybe if somebody doozer. That's like a kid's nickname, isn't it? Hey doozer. If somebody does like classics of the new wave or modern classics of the new wave, then maybe, but it's probably not going to happen. So I think somebody at Penguins had this idea and they're just jumping on it. However, I will say it's really good to see this book claimed by Gertrude Barrows Bennett. Now, you don't get many authors calling themselves Gertrude Barrows Bennett these days. And this is quite an obscure one. It's quite slender, as you see. And again, nice cover. And, you know, she is obscure. She's sort of like early 20th century SF fantasy horror writer. And I don't think this has been in print for a very long time. And it's nice and brief. You read the back of it, and it says, woken from his sleep by an urgent request to attend a new patient, Dr. John Vanneman is soon at the house of Jesse J. Robinson, a wealthy industrialist struck gravely ill after struggle with a burglar. The thief was after Robinson's most prized possession, an item he obsessively guards, a mysterious green box. We're kind of in A. Merritt territory here. Do you know what I'm saying? So very like A. Merritt. It's one of these occult detective things. Charles Williams comes to mind as well, but I'm sure that's going to be a lark. So that's what I would have picked up anyway. Also, another one that I would have picked up anyway is this one, which is Penguin have done other editions of this. And they used to do a black classic. It was one of the American black classics. And it was really nice. It had a cat on the cover. And I've read a lot by this author over the years. It's a good little collection. So they've just reissued it in the weird fiction livery and Ancient Sorceries. And I do quite like the typefaces they use. And I like the fact this is pink. So, of course, they're going with very garish colours because garish colours like yellow, the colour of decadence and symbolism. So this is the adventures of John Silence, who's a doctor. And again, he's a classic occult detective. I mean, you get him, you get William Hope Hodgson's Karnaki the Ghost Finder. And I'm not a massive fan of Blackwood, but he does have something of the mystical about him, and he's quite good with depictions of nature I much prefer M.R. James and Arthur Machen. But I'm glad this is back in print in Penguin. It's really, really nice because I've wanted a nice copy of Ancient Sources for ages. Now, the correspondent on my channel made the point that most of these books have been reissued in hardcover in recent years by Pushkin Press, and they have. And I've got all the ones he mentions, except they did one for this last year in hardcover about a year ago. But I didn't like it. It was sort of black jacket, and it had this sort of bronzy laminate on, which I didn't think was very nice. So I think that's good. So that's a peach as well. Then, of course, I mean, a book which used to be really obscure. It was in all the reference books, which is how I discovered it. I think it was in Stephen Jones and Kim Newman's Horror, the 100 Best Books, probably. And Hey Steve, I don't know if Kim watches. I know Steve does now and again. It's a good guy. And really, it was quite obscure for a long time. And that's The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers. Going back about 4 or 5 years ago, there was a nice Pushkin hardcover. And of course, it came to prominence when people were watching the first season of True Detective, Carcosa, the Yellow King. And, you know, these are great stories. And the good thing about this is that, unlike a lot of other editions, it drops the other stuff. It's very slim. It's just got the 4 or 5 proper Carcosa stories, because everything else he wrote was kind of slushy romance, really. So this is just those stories. And again, really nice cover. Look at that. Isn't that great? And I just think it's lovely to have, because the edition that's been available in the UK, because these are all out of copyright, of course, was a very cheap Wordsworth edition with a yellow cover. And it retails about $2.99. And I've sold loads and loads and loads of it for years and years and years, because I just put a face out, a little card underneath saying, Carcosa, the Yellow King. If you watch True Detective, you must read this, and so on. But these are fantastic stories. They're very lush and colourful and nebulous and strange. And you can see the influence this would have had over Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith, even Jack Vance. I mean, this is kind of the beginning, really, of the true weird fiction thing. I would say this is one of the most authentic ones. And the realm of Carcosa comes up in all sorts of places. So it's nice to see a really nice mass market paperback edition of The King in Yellow for the first time in who knows how long. I certainly can't remember one. And of course, it is a pure one because it drops the other stories, the other stuff. So there you go. Finally, again, another book that's out of copyright. Penguin did an A format edition of this about 10 years ago, and then they let it go. And it's weird. It's becoming eclipsed by a book which was always less famous, but people seem to be reading more, which is a book called The Nightland. And we're talking about William Hope Hodgson, and this is The House on the Borderland, the swine things. And I like this book a lot. This is great. I first read this a very long time ago. And it is one of the definitive, hoary, swampy, vertiginous, vortex-like, was it vortices? You know, it really sucks you in, and it's about a liminal space as well. So it ticks all the kind of boxes, really. And it's great. A friend of mine called his band The Swine Things. That was like back in the 1980s. I think they were a heavy metal band. But yeah, this is nice. I mean, there's other editions out. There's a British Library one, which I'm not so keen on. I think British Library have produced too much in recent years. They've had Mike Ashley, who's brilliant, working away on all sorts of things. And it's one of those things. I mean, I can claim to a degree possibly that it's my fault with that, because when British Library started doing their vintage crime things, I wrote to them and said, how about some vintage SF? And, you know, a little while, but a year after that, it started to appear, and there's lots of anthologies and stuff, and maybe some things which probably should have stayed out of print. So maybe it's my fault. I don't know. So there you go. But House on the Borderland, very, very nice indeed. So, you know, they are nice. You know, they're you know, for the devotees, for the hardcore people, you know, who know all this stuff. They're not anything special, with the possible exception of this. And this is a bit thrown together. But if you haven't read these stories, it's your first time, then fine. So if you're a weird fiction newbie, then that's absolutely great. You know, you'll enjoy them there. So there you go. And they are pretty. You know, they're B format. I'd have liked them in A myself. But I think they wanted to give the cover art more justice. The best thing about them is they're not slathered in text. A lot of contemporary books now have tons of text all over them. And you look at them and they're way, way too busy. But these, they've just gone for the colours and a nice consistent look, which is fantastic. So speaking of weird fiction, I've been looking at this, a book I hadn't read for a long time. This is The Saliva Tree by Brian Aldiss, which is the Celebrity is a novella, and there's also short stories in this. And this is a Faber first edition from 1966 that a friend of mine gave me a little while ago. It's got a bit of a chip in there, but it's nice, isn't it? That nice little octavo hardcover. And the title story of this, people often say it's very like The Colour Out of Space by H.P. Lovecraft, and it is actually, and I'm sort of more than over Lovecraft. I don't think I'll ever read any again. And I read it all years and years ago, and people go on and on and on about them, and it just get a bit tiresome, And this is an interesting one because it's like that story, and basically in that story, something comes down from space, and it infects this farm with the strange sort of colours, and things start to mutate and change. This is effectively what happens in this, but this is set in round about the very end of the 19th century, because one of the characters in this, he has a correspondence with H.G. Wells, and what it does, it takes elements of War of the Worlds, The Invisible Man, very much from Food of the Gods, but not The Time Machine, and it meshes them together. And there's no doubt that Aldiss would have been aware of The Colour Out of Space, but this is written more in the sort of English rural style. And of course, Aldiss was from rural Oxfordshire, and this is set sort of nearer to Norwich, which is more northeast, but still in that sort of ballpark, Middle Britain. And I love Aldiss, but there's certain things that stand out more. This isn't one of the best ones, but it was entertaining, and there's a sort of facility in the language. Is it better than The Colour Out of Space? Well, in terms of the writing, it probably is. Is it as powerful? Probably not. And that's the thing with Lovecraft. He does have a certain sort of strange primal power for all his flaws. So that's a kind of weird fiction thing as well, but it's more definitively SF. And I enjoyed it because I have had a bit of an issue recently trying to get back into reading because I just haven't been enjoying it. And I think I'm not saying coming to the end of my reading journey. I will always read, but I do feel myself pulling away from fiction at the moment, which is kind of ironic since I'm running a channel which is mostly about SF. There's plenty more coming up. Anyway, I just thought you'd like to see those after my walkabout yesterday. And one more thing to say, that walkabout, that video, I threw that together. I'll be quite honest and say I threw it together. And, maybe I've got a good eye. People seem to like it. But more people have watched it than the William Gibson video I released the following week, which took me about 8 to 10 hours to make. And it's a much better video in my view, but it just goes to show, it's the thing. I mean, weird fiction maybe is the thing of the moment over Neuromancer. If you haven't watched my Neuromancer video, have a look because it's got some great visuals and I wax lyrical in my style. But yeah, look at that. I bought a trilogy. Now that's the weirdest thing of all. Anyway, have a great weekend. I'll see you soon. Bye for now.